Hello, and welcome to episode 206 of Prose.
This week, both stories have a shared theme of memory. So let's all ponder what it means to remember and what it costs to forget, shall we? As per the usual, I'll beg you all to go follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Even more amazing would be if you could head over to Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes, and leave a rating and or review for Prose. Ratings and reviews set the show up for continuing into the future, and they really help me, know you're listening. It'd be great if I could see some. For easiest access to the show, subscribe using Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast catcher is your favorite. And certainly, thank you all for listening. I won't ramble on in this rasp. Let's just get to the tale, shall we? This week, we have the forgetting and the language of the lesser. Enjoy. The Forgetting, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Mr. Synnax. Please, call me Jessam. Okay, Jessam. You do need to keep in mind that the basic package does not guarantee a complete wipe. Certainly the process is called the forgetting, but the problem comes when you don't opt in for the additional process of the forbidding. We can mute and scrub and delete all day, but synaptic pathways do some strange things when, well, to be quite frank, when they're damaged. Albeit here we're doing it knowingly and with purpose. Still, the forbidding actually tracks the roots of those memories and kills them at their source and along those synaptic pathways to boot. The neural scouring that the forgetting offers is nothing short of miraculous, but a stray memory or two might escape the process. Well, Doc, I certainly do appreciate your candor and your honesty both, but I fear that I really can't even afford the forgetting. I'm doing that and getting myself into what my mama used to call a tight spot, so I'll have to stick with just that procedure. Well, Jessam, lie back and relax. I'm going to give you a quick-acting sedative, and we'll get you right down to some erasure, eh? Thank you so much, sir. With that, the doctor held the device to Jessam's neck and released the hypospray sedative into his bloodstream through his neck. Jessam only felt a little pressure, not even enough to constitute a pinch, and he was already getting groggy from the drugs. Quick acting, indeed. Oh, Jessam, he heard through the fog of the drug. It would make the forgetting so much more effective if you'll think on all those memories that you want stricken from your neural networks. That'll get them all roiled up to the surface for us. Thanks. The doctor bustled out of the room, assumingly to get nurses, fancy equipment, and whatever else it is that doctors do to prepare and change patients' lives for forever. Jessam couldn't help but think on how expensive all this was. He honestly might be indebted to his med creditors for the remainder of his life, but then again, that was nothing new for someone of his station in life. Why not get some actual use out of the med establishment while accruing that debt? After all, he'd already been spending far too many credits on all that from-home borrow-my-bliss counseling, where he was leeching others' happy emotions into his own head to try to counterbalance all of this. He began to think on Chisindra and all the time they shared together. That was what the doctor had said to do. Reaching back for those once rosy memories was extremely painful for him, though. Hence coming in for the forgetting. His memories of her and their life together were far too fresh and far too sharp for him to reach out and touch, even after 2 years of distance between the good times and the fallout from her leaving. He had, at least, trained himself to avoid reaching out for those remembrances during any given day. By no means did he ever go out of his way to think of her, of places they'd been together, of phrases they'd used, songs they'd liked. Hell, he'd all but done a combo forgetting and forbidding on himself in the conscious waking world. But the conscious waking world was not his problem. Jacindra came to him when he was at his most mentally vulnerable. She came to him in the dark hours of the night when he was sleeping. She came to him near dawn, when determining the difference between fantasy and reality is as thin and vaporous as the remaining slight fog that hovers around the air awaiting dispelling by the sun's strengthening rays. She came to him at moments of downtime when his mind would wander all over time and space, yawning out into eternity and somehow always ending up back in some version of reality where the two of them were together and happy with animals and children and friends and a shared existence. Those times of vulnerability demonstrated to Jessam that he could not banish her on his own. So med procedure it was. The worst part of those subconscious attacks from his own memories was that they always made him feel better, more complete, less alone. They felt right. He would wake up after a particularly poignant fantasy mixed with past moment, absolutely beaming at just how much fun Jacindra and he had just had taking Noah out to the zoo for his 4th birthday. Noah careened and cooed and shouted out of pure joy when he saw the giraffes, the elephants, the cave spiders from Rigel, and all the other creatures. They'd purchased a small child-sized blue cake of a furry cartoon Muppet that Noah was currently into and left it at the zoo's commissary. When it was time to eat the cake, the silly boy promptly put his right hand into the middle of it and shoved a fist-sized dough and icing ball smack in the middle of his own face. Jacindra, the other commissary customers, the staff, and he all cackled and hooted at the happy little boy making memories that would comfort and embrace him for a lifetime. Then a shaft of sunlight would hit Jessam through a crack in the curtains, or some scuffling from the apartment upstairs would catch his attention. Or his alarm clock would go off for the 14th time, reminding him that he really did have to roll out of bed and face the world. Reminding him that the zoo, Noah, Jacindra, the Muppet Cake, that was all just an extrapolation on the life he'd thought he'd had with her. None of that could ever be real. Two nurses and who he thought was still the same doctor came sauntering back into the room with a med cart. They didn't really speak to him. Everyone just went about their job rather, surgically and with purpose. They gave him an IV, he presumed to ensure that his initial sedatives didn't wear off halfway through the procedure, and they began to clean his temples, going so far as to shave away the downy little mousy brown hairs that still remained there on the upper sides of his head. All this for a neural wipe? He began to get a bit nervous and wished he hadn't been so insistent that he didn't need any anti-anxiety medication. Tubes and wires, syringes and corked beakers. The little wheeled cart was filled with every cliche from a medical neurocast or the old sci-fi thrillers of yesteryear, and that made him feel even more nervous. His equipment certainly didn't look like cutting-edge stuff. But who was he to judge? Amidst his worrying, he started thinking on the doctor's explanation of the forbidding, and began to have a sinking feeling. His time at the zoo with Noah and Jacindra, that wasn't a memory. That wasn't something they had done. It was a manifestation of what he had thought they would do. An extrapolation based on who they were and the things they'd done, yes. But it wasn't an actual memory. Surely this is what the doctor meant would not be covered by the forgetting processes. And that was wholly unacceptable. Jessam began to think about how those joyful memories might feel without any real tether to reality. Chisindra and their relationship never existed, so his perfect day with his wife and child at the zoo would seem nothing but whole cloth, thought up from a dream. He would spend his days living out never-to-be-had moments with the woman of his dreams, and never know that they had actually shared 5 wonderful years together before everything soured. The prospect of deifying Chisindra while never knowing that he'd known her, been with her, been a part of her, well, that sounded like a version of hell to him. Sure, he wanted things to go back the way they had been before. He wanted his old life back. But he would rather be tortured by those could-have-been fantasies and have context than to pine away after something and someone his brain would demand was nothing but fiction. Jessam tried to speak up, but he found his jaw heavy from the earlier sedatives now mixing with the IV cocktail. He tried to move, but his body was disconnected from him. He tried to give a knowing stare to the nurses, but they only bustled about him, and he was pretty sure his half-lidded eyes were anything but knowing. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't even manage a gurgle. He felt his eyes flickering with even more weight as the nurse applied a dainty squeeze to the bag, smiling at him. He couldn't fight it. It was too late. He did feel tears come down his cheeks as the world turned black and he saw Chisindra and Noah well in front of him, beckoning him to hurry on up so they could make the exotic birds' flights of fancy show at the zoo. Suddenly, Jessam couldn't remember why the tears were on his cheeks. He had never been happier as he jogged up to his wife and son. Maybe that was it. Tears of joy at just how special this was. Just how perfect their time together was for him. That was it, yeah. Tears of joy. He grasped her hand with his left and his little hand with his right, and they walked as a family toward the bird enclosure. Thank you for listening to The Forgetting. The 2 backing tracks for this story were both taken from Free Music Archive at freemusicarchive.com. Both of these tracks are being used under CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. Next up, please do stick around for the second story this week, The Language of the Lesser. The Language of the Lesser, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Their shared language was the one source of light in these darkest of times. Long ago, the upper crust's nasal elongations of vowels and crisp T's had gone extinct, an irony that Stepan could not help but appreciate to its fullest. All that was left now was the patois of the underclass, those that were not in the cities, those that still kept up the shibboleth each winter solstice. The chants had long ago lost their meanings to the masses of urbanites out on the coastal regions of Nurisfeld, but their lessers had clung to the folklore and legends that were so infused with their bucolic ways of life, that praised those ways of life in their very own dialect. Certainly, the occasional scholar would come out to the meadows and the bogs and the shadowed woods to collect specimens of their backward ways and linguistic practices. But that is all it was to those scholars. A morass of nearly unintelligible beliefs, customs, and means of communication to be catalogued, filed away and forgotten to the dustbin of history. Maybe someday in the far future, some quirky author would use their ways for the basis of a fantastical novel, or some desperate academic would build their dissertation on the obscurity that would be these nothings from the past. But again, that was what had made Stepan grin grimly. All those snotty scholars were dead, alongside their ministerial and parliamentary masters. They had burned right alongside everyone else that scoffed at the olden ways. The solstice this year had fallen upon a Friday. In the cities, this meant that the citizens would have been getting dressed in their finest, heading out to the clubs and the bars and the holocasts and all the drug, drink, and sex-addled places that made up the weekend religion of the elite. Stepan and his family, along with every other laboring family in every other countryside across all of Nurisfeld, did not have those options, though. Moreover, they knew better than to shy away from their due diligence. Millennia of safety had been born of keeping with tradition, and they would not abandon it, not even in this modern age. So as their urban counterparts went into their Friday evening exploits, as they always did, Stepan and the lower nobodies of the world made their way into the now dormant wheat fields. They erected shamblemen of the best sheaves of wheat they had dried and stored for just this purpose, sacrificing what would have been fine grains for eating to a much more important purpose. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of these shamblemen dotted the dark places of Nurisfeld that longest of winter nights. The holy men and holy women chanted prayers in the old dialect, the lesser patois that was so gauche in the modern world. And then the farmers and woodsmen and weaver women and other working people of the world came together and set flame to those dried shamblemen, bringing light to the world at the longest and coldest and darkest of times. Those flaming bundles shone brighter than the neon pulses of the city's clubs and bars and festival grounds, brighter than their transports and hover trains and flight ports. And something noticed. The news that came later of what happened out in the cities was wonderful and terrifying. Some sort of apocalyptic force had smote the cities down, punishing them for their hubris, like some long-ago cliched epic from yesteryear. Reports of fire raining down from the heavens on the west coast. Communiques of the tides rising and crashing in like never before on the east coast. Tales of the wildlife going berserk and striking out against their oppressors on the southern coast. Whispers of the cold taking over the northern coasts, freezing them like some sort of magical force out of a fairy book. The Middlelands, though, they were spared. Whatever they had done with those sheaves of wheat had saved them. The shibboleth that had continued unbroken since times immemorial apparently had a purpose after all. The language of the lesser, as the learned men and women called Stepan and his family's manner of speech, had prayed, chanted, rhymed, and sang the apocalypse away, much as the folk tales and myths had suggested they might. Stepan looked out on a quiet Sunday morning, wondering if someday his accent would be the one to be considered uppity or snooty or important. He certainly hoped not. He wanted to keep his connection to his roots and to the power of yesterday. Thank you for listening to The Language of the Lesser. All sounds and music you hear come from freemusicarchive.com, and they are being used under CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. That does it this week for Prose. I certainly hope that moving forward you'll keep your eyes peeled for our continued episodes into this new year. For now, as always, please do love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always stranger than fiction. See you next time.